The year is 1894. Winter has fallen on Chicago, hard and unforgiving. The wind coming off Lake Michigan is a physical thing, a blade of ice that cuts through the thickest wool coats and chills a man to his bones. It scours the frozen mud and skeletal trees of Jackson Park, a landscape now haunted by ghosts. The ghosts of laughter, of music, of gasps of awe from millions of visitors. The ghosts of the greatest spectacle the modern world had ever witnessed. The world's Columbian Exposition, the White City. It had closed its gates forever on the last day of October 1893. A dream metropolis of soaring domes, triumphant arches, and classical facades that seemed to rise from the lakeside marsh not by the hand of man, but by the will of gods. Over 200 buildings, many of them the largest ever constructed, covering nearly 700 acres. A gleaming, pearlescent city built, they said, in less than 2 years. And now, it was being erased. Our witness is not a man of importance. He is not a Daniel Burnham or a Frederick Law Olmsted, the famed architects and planners whose names are forever tied to the fair. He is not a wealthy industrialist or a city alderman. His name is Thomas Rook, and he is a night watchman. A former soldier whose limp from a long-forgotten campaign made him unsuitable for the factory floor, but perfect for the lonely, plodding work of guarding empty spaces. His job, for a handful of dollars a week, was to patrol a specific quadrant of the now-silent fairgrounds, to walk among the frozen lagoons and the colossal, shadowed forms of the vacant palaces, to ensure vagrants did not take shelter, to watch for the first signs of fire, and most importantly, to keep his eyes down and his mouth shut. It was in the deepest dark of a January night that Thomas Rook's world began to unravel. He was on his usual route, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, the rhythmic tap of his walking stick the only sound for miles. He was passing the looming edifice of the Palace of Mechanic Arts, a building so vast it was said you could fit the entire United States Congress, Senate, and House on its floor with room to spare. The moonlight cast strange shadows on its ornate facade, a material they called staff, a mixture, the official story went, of plaster of Paris, hemp fibers, and a little bit of glue. A temporary stage dressing for a temporary show. But Thomas had stood next to these walls every night for 2 months. He had leaned against them to escape the wind. He had touched their surfaces. Temporary did not feel like the right word. The walls felt ancient. They felt solid, dense, and cold in a way that plaster should not. There was a resonance to them, a low hum that you felt more in your teeth than you heard with your ears, especially on the coldest nights. On this night, something was different. A flicker of light. Not the gentle, yellow glow of a gas lamp, but a harsh, blue-white arc, spitting and hissing from the far side of the building. It was coming from a section that was supposed to be restricted, marked for the first phase of demolition. Curiosity, a dangerous luxury for a man in his position, got the better of him. He strayed from his designated path, his limp suddenly more pronounced as he navigated the frozen debris of the court of honor. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. This was not demolition. He had seen demolition crews before. Men with sledgehammers, with ropes and pulleys, with teams of horses. A slow, brutal, chaotic process of chipping away at a structure until it collapsed. This was not that. A crew of about 24 men moved with a silent, disciplined efficiency that was deeply unsettling. They were not dressed like any work crew he had ever seen. They wore thick, dark, one-piece suits that seemed to repel the biting cold, with heavy-duty gauntlets and strange, goggled masks that hid their faces. And their tools. They were not using sledgehammers. They held long, metallic wands connected by thick, braided cables to a large, humming generator mounted on a wagon. It was this generator that was the source of the unnatural light. One of the men would press the tip of his wand to the base of a towering column. There would be a high-pitched whine that made Thomas's teeth ache, a brilliant flash of that blue-white light, and the base of the column would not crumble or explode. It would simply dissolve. It turned into a fine, gray dust that was instantly whipped away by the wind, leaving no trace. There was no noise of falling masonry, no cloud of plaster dust, just a silent, surgical erasure. Thomas shrank back into the shadows of a nearby statuary, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched as they worked their way along the base of the building, dissolving pillar after pillar with this impossible technology. He saw a foreman, distinguished only by a red band on his arm, consult a complex diagram that seemed to glow with its own faint light. They were not just tearing it down. They were dismantling it, carefully, precisely, as if following an instruction manual for something they had not built and did not fully understand. He stayed there for what felt like hours, frozen to the spot not by the cold, but by a primal fear. He saw one of the workers, momentarily careless, swing his wand too close to a discarded block of the staff material. The arc leaped from the wand to the block. For a split second, the block glowed from within, a soft, pearlescent white, the color of a summer moon. It seemed to resist, to push back against the energy of the wand. The worker wrestled with it, the generator on the wagon screaming in protest, before the block finally succumbed, turning to that same fine, gray dust. It was then that Thomas Rook understood. Whatever these buildings were made of, it was not plaster. Plaster does not glow. Plaster does not fight back. His shift ended before dawn. He fled the park, not walking, but scrambling, his report book forgotten. He went home to his small room and sat in the dark. The image of the glowing stone burned into his mind. When he reported for his shift the next night, he was met at the gate by two men in expensive-looking dark coats and bowler hats. They did not work for the security company. They did not look like they had ever done a day of manual labor in their lives. "Your services are no longer required, Mr. Rook," the first man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But my pay," Thomas began. The second man stepped forward, pressing a small, heavy cloth bag into Thomas's hand. It was far more money than he was owed. "This is for your silence," he said, not unkindly, but with an air of absolute finality. "You saw nothing last night. The Palace of Mechanic Arts is being demolished in the usual way. A small, accidental fire may have occurred. That is all." Thomas looked past them, toward the park. In the gray morning light, a thick plume of black smoke was rising from the exact spot where he had seen the strange crew working. A fire. The official story was already being written. "You are a man who understands the wisdom of forgetting," the first man added. It was not a question. "There is nothing more for you here." Thomas Rook took the money. He turned his back on the White City and walked away. He never spoke of what he saw. He tried to forget, but he couldn't. For the rest of his life, he would be haunted by the memory of a stone that glowed and the silent, terrifying efficiency of the men who had come to kill it. But that is not the story they tell you. The official records, the history books, the Ken Burns documentaries, they all tell a very different tale. They speak of logistical triumphs and architectural genius. They speak of the Herculean effort to build a temporary city of dreams on a swamp. They tell you the White City was a magnificent illusion, a theatrical set made of staff, a mixture of plaster and jute fiber, stretched over wooden and steel frames. Beautiful, yes. Inspiring, absolutely. But temporary. Designed to be discarded. They say the demolition was a sad but necessary affair. The fair was over, the bonds had to be paid, and the city of Chicago wanted its park back. The cost of maintaining the buildings, they claim, would have been astronomical. So, the wrecking ball and the firebrand were brought in. Wrecking companies were hired. A few buildings were sold and moved, a few were dismantled for scrap. And then came the fires. A series of massive, spectacular fires that, one by one, consumed the grandest palaces of the fair. The first, and most famous, was the fire that destroyed the immense manufactures and liberal arts building in January 1894. Then another in February. And the grand finale, a blaze in July that leveled almost everything that was left, including the great terminal station and the administration building. The papers called it a holocaust of grandeur. The authorities blamed vagrants, careless workers, arsonists. Tragic accidents, they said. A pitiful end to a glorious chapter. So the official story is this. A temporary city, built of temporary materials, was intentionally demolished and accidentally burned down until nothing was left but a few minor structures and a whole lot of memories. It was all gone within a year. It is a neat story, a tidy story, a story that fits perfectly within our understanding of 19th century capabilities. And it is a lie. Every single part of it is a lie. The timeline, the materials, the construction, the demolition, the motive, It is the greatest architectural cover-up in human history. So let us do what the men in the dark coats told Thomas Rook not to do. Let us look closer. Let us question the neat, tidy story. Let us examine the impossibilities, the contradictions, the things that simply do not add up. Welcome to the real story of the White City. Welcome to the story they tried to erase. We begin with the material itself. Staff. Go to any museum exhibit about the 1893 World's Fair, and you will see a chunk of it. A crumbly, yellowish piece of what looks like old drywall. You will read the label that says this is what the entire White City was made of. Plaster of Paris and hemp fiber. You are meant to look at it. Marvel at the artistry that could shape such humble material into a convincing replica of a Roman temple and move on. But let's apply some simple logic. Let's engage in some basic engineering analysis that seems to have been suspended by historians for over a century. Chicago, the Windy City, a place of brutal winters and humid summers. A city famous for its dramatic and violent weather swings. The fair ran from May to October 1893. The construction began in 1891. This means these plaster and hemp facades stood exposed to the elements for at least 2, and in some cases, 3 full Chicago weather cycles. They endured torrential spring rains, blistering summer sun and humidity, and the first freezing gales of autumn. Have you ever seen what happens to a bag of plaster left out in the rain? It becomes a useless, mushy lump. Have you ever seen what happens to a sheet of drywall exposed to moisture? It swells, it sags, it disintegrates. It grows black mold. Yet we are asked to believe that hundreds of acres of impossibly intricate facades, miles of detailed cornices, thousands of delicate sculptures, vast, sweeping archways, all made of this material, stood pristine for years. Look at the photographs from the fair. Do you see any water stains? Do you see any sagging? Do you see any cracks or patches? No. You see perfection. Gleaming, monolithic, seamless perfection. The official explanation for this is that the staff was coated with a special mixture of oil and paint to protect it. A single coat of paint was supposed to shield this glorified papier-mâché from lakefront gales that could peel the siding off a wooden house. It's an explanation so flimsy it insults the intelligence. Any modern contractor would laugh you out of the room if you suggested such a thing. Now let's consider the testimony of those who worked with it. Not the official pronouncements of the architects, but the grumblings of the workers. We must turn to the forgotten sources, the whispers in the historical record. Buried in a 1912 memoir by a low-level site manager, a man named Frank Millet, a man who would later die on the Titanic, another event shrouded in convenient narratives, is a curious passage. He complains about the difficulty of working with the so-called staff. He describes it not as a plaster that could be molded and shaped, but as a material that had to be carved and ground. He speaks of saw blades dulling at an incredible rate, of drill bits snapping, of the strange, resonant sound the material made when struck. This does not sound like plaster and hemp. This sounds like stone, or something harder. Let's return to the fictional journal of our night watchman, Thomas Rook. Of course, the journal itself is a narrative device, but it represents the synthesis of dozens of anecdotal accounts, deathbed confessions, and third-hand stories passed down through families who have been dismissed as crackpots for generations. These are the voices of the silenced witnesses. February 10th, 1894. The entry might read, I cannot get the image out of my head. The block of wall. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a bread box, that had fallen from a cornice. One of the men in the black suits kicked it, perhaps to test its weight. It didn't move. He kicked it again, harder. He might as well have kicked the foundation of the earth. Later, after they were gone, I went to it. I had my hammer from my tool bag. I struck it. Not a chip. Not a scratch. The hammer just bounced off, the vibration jarring my whole arm. The sound was wrong. Not the dull thud of stone, but a clear, ringing note, like a bell. I touched it. Even in the bitter cold, it held a strange, faint warmth. Like a sleeping animal. Plaster. They have the nerve to call it plaster. This is the first pillar of the lie. The material. They created an absurd cover story for a substance they could not replicate and did not want to explain. A substance that was weatherproof, impossibly durable, and possessed strange energetic properties. A substance that was not staff, but something else entirely. Perhaps a form of geopolymer concrete, a technology we are only now beginning to rediscover. Perhaps it was something far more advanced, a type of self-healing, living stone, the stuff of alchemy and legend. Whatever it was not temporary. And if the material wasn't temporary, then the entire premise for the demolition collapses. You don't tear down a city made of miraculous, everlasting stone because it's too expensive to maintain. You don't do it. Unless you have to. Unless you are terrified of what it represents. Now we move to the second impossibility, the construction. The official timeline is ludicrous on its face. The site for the fair, Jackson Park, was a 700-acre swamp. It was undeveloped, waterlogged, and unstable. The decision to grant the fair to Chicago was made in 1890. Serious groundbreaking and landscaping, we are told, began in 1891. The fair opened in May of 1893. Let's be clear about what this timeline implies. It implies that in roughly 24 months, the titans of Chicago industry and the architectural minds of the Gilded Age managed to 1. Drain and reshape a 700-acre swamp. 2. Dig miles of canals, basins, and lagoons, and line them with stone. 3. Construct over 200 buildings from the ground up, including the single largest building on Earth at the time, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, which covered over 30 acres under one roof. 4. Erect these buildings not as simple barns, but as the most ornate, classically detailed structures imaginable, covered in thousands of complex statues and reliefs. 5. Install miles of electrical wiring, plumbing, and a full-scale electric railway, the first of its kind. 6. All of this, using 19th-century technology. Horse-drawn carts, steam-powered cranes with limited reach, manual labor with hand tools. Is it any wonder that contemporary engineers, when presented with this timeline today, simply shake their heads and say, "Impossible?" They are right. It is impossible. Let's just take one building. The aforementioned Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building. It was 1,687 feet long and 787 feet wide. Its central hall was unencumbered by columns, spanned by enormous steel arches. The volume of the building was over 44 million cubic feet. The official records state that its construction required 5 carloads of nails and 17 million feet of lumber for the flooring alone. The amount of steel in its roof trusses was 3 times the amount used in the recently completed Brooklyn Bridge. And they claim they built this, from swamp to finished structure, in about 18 months. This is not a construction project. This is a fairy tale. Even if you accept the absurd premise that it was all just a flimsy wooden frame with a plaster skin, the logistics still don't work. The manpower required, the coordination, the sheer amount of material that would need to be transported to the site on horse-drawn wagons over muddy, unpaved roads. It defies all practical reality. So what is the alternative? What if they didn't build it? What if they found it? This is the central thesis. The great, forbidden thought. The Chicago World's Columbian Exposition was not a construction project. It was a renovation project. A discovery. Imagine the scene. The industrialists of Chicago, the Armours, the Pullmans, the Fields, looking for a site for their grand fair. They know of the swampy, undeveloped land south of the city. Perhaps during surveying, or during some preliminary excavation, they strike something. Not mud, not bedrock, but a perfectly smooth, impossibly hard surface. They dig further. They uncover a wall, a foundation, a staircase leading down into the dark, peaty soil. They realize they haven't found a swamp. They have found a buried city. A city of breathtaking scale and impossible beauty, preserved in the anaerobic environment of the marsh. A city of gleaming white stone that doesn't weather or crumble. A city built by an unknown civilization, for an unknown purpose. What do you do with a discovery like that? A discovery that would rewrite every history book, every religious text, every scientific paradigm. If you are a 19th century industrialist, a man whose power is built on the new paradigms of coal, steel, and wage labor, you do not announce it to the world. A discovery of this magnitude is not a resource, it is a threat. It speaks of a past that was grander than your present, of a technology that is superior to your own. It undermines the very narrative of progress that underpins your wealth and authority. So you can't announce it, but you also can't ignore it. It's the biggest thing in the world, sitting right in your backyard. And you are, above all, a businessman. You see an opportunity. You decide to host a World's Fair. It's the perfect cover. You build a grand exposition. You bring in the world's most famous architects to design the buildings. In reality, their job is to retrofit them, to give them names that fit your narrative. The Palace of Mechanic Arts, the Hall of Mines and Mining. You give these ancient, silent structures a new, temporary purpose. You excavate the city, clean it up, wire it with Mr. Edison's new light bulbs, and you present it to the world as your own creation. You present it as the pinnacle of your civilization, when in fact, you are nothing but a squatter in the house of a giant. Suddenly, the impossible timeline makes perfect sense. They didn't need 2 years to build a city. They needed 2 years to dig it out of the mud. The Herculean effort wasn't construction, it was excavation and restoration. The thousands of workers weren't carpenters and plasterers. They were laborers clearing away centuries of accumulated earth and silt. This staff was a cover story for the miraculous material they found. The lagoons and canals weren't newly dug. They were the original water-filled boulevards and channels of this ancient lakeside metropolis, simply dredged and cleaned. This is the only explanation that fits the physical evidence and the impossible speed of the project. They didn't build the White City. They unveiled it. And the moment they unveiled it, they began planning its destruction. This brings us to the silenced expert. In every great cover-up, there is always someone on the inside who knows too much, who asks the wrong questions, and who must be neutralized. In our story, that man is Professor Alastair Finch. Again, Finch is a composite figure, a symbol of the academic and scientific integrity that was sacrificed at the altar of the new industrial narrative. He represents the handful of engineers, geologists, and architects of the time who looked at the White City and knew, with the certainty of their professional training, that something was profoundly wrong with the official story. Let us imagine Professor Finch, a professor of structural engineering at the nascent University of Chicago, a meticulous man of science, a believer in numbers, stress loads, and material integrity. In early 1893, as the fair is nearing completion, he is granted a commission by the Exposition Company. A prestigious task. He is to conduct a thorough study of the construction methods and materials used in the great buildings, to create a definitive report for posterity, a document that will cement the fair's legacy as an engineering marvel. He accepts with patriotic enthusiasm. He arrives at the fairgrounds with his team of graduate students, armed with calipers, transits, and notebooks. And almost immediately, he begins to notice the anomalies. He starts at the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building. He studies the great steel trusses of the roof. The official plans, provided by the lead engineer, are detailed. But when Finch takes his own measurements, they don't quite match. The metallurgy of the steel seems different. It's lighter than any known steel formulation of the time, yet exhibits a tensile strength that his calculations say shouldn't be possible. He discreetly takes a small sample for later analysis. Then he turns his attention to the foundations. According to the plans, the massive buildings are resting on immense grids of timber driven into the unstable soil. A floating foundation. It's a clever solution, but for a structure of this weight, Finch calculates the load. The numbers are staggering. The pressure on the soil should be causing significant, visible subsidence. The buildings should be sinking unevenly into the marsh. But they are not. They are perfectly level, as if they are anchored not to a swamp, but to the bedrock of the planet. He moves on to the staff facades. He's been told it's plaster. He knows what plaster can and cannot do. He sees the vast, unsupported spans, the razor-thin-looking walls that soar hundreds of feet into the air. His engineer's mind screams that this is impossible. These structures should not be able to support their own weight, let alone a Chicago snow load or a 60-mile-per-hour gale. He requests permission to take a core sample from a main support column of the administration building. The request is met with a bizarre series of bureaucratic delays. Finally, a smirking official tells him that such a test would be structurally compromising to the temporary building. A professor of engineering, being told not to drill a 1-inch hole in a 10-foot-thick column for fear it will collapse. The excuse is so absurd it's insulting. Finch becomes obsessed. He and his students start conducting their work at night, using the fair's own dazzling electrical lights to continue their measurements. They survey the layout of the entire park. and they find the most damning piece of evidence yet. The entire city is laid out with a geometric precision that is beyond the capability of 19th-century surveying equipment. The angles are too perfect. The alignments, not just to each other, but to celestial bodies, the solstice sunrises, the position of certain stars, are too deliberate. It's not just a city, it's an observatory, a machine, a colossal, silent instrument of unknown function. Finch compiles his report. It is a meticulous, 200-page document filled with calculations, diagrams, and material analysis. His conclusion is explosive. He states, in dry, academic language, that the world's Columbian Exposition could not have been built as claimed. He theorizes that the buildings are of an unknown, ancient origin. He suggests this staff is a form of advanced geopolymer, and that the steel has been manufactured with a process unknown to modern science. He concludes that the fair is not a new construction, but the restoration of a pre-existing site of immense archaeological and scientific importance. He urges, in the strongest possible terms, that the planned demolition be halted and a proper international scientific investigation be launched. He presents his report to the Exposition's Board of Directors in a closed-door meeting in September 1893. He expects debate, perhaps skepticism. He does not expect the reaction he receives. Silence. A cold, dead silence from the men of industry and finance. They do not look at his data. They do not question his calculations. The chairman of the board, a man whose name is synonymous with railroad monopolies and banking trusts, simply takes the report, a single copy, and drops it into a leather briefcase. "Thank you for your fanciful work, Professor," the chairman says, a thin, mirthless smile on his lips. "Your commission is now concluded. A check for your services will be sent to the university. We trust you will be discreet." The dismissal is absolute. Within a week, Finch is informed that his funding at the university has been cut. A rival professor, a man known for his pliability, is promoted to head of the department. Whispers begin to circulate in the academic community that Professor Finch has suffered a mental breakdown, that he has become obsessed with occult theories and unscientific fantasies. His professional reputation is methodically dismantled. His students are warned that any association with him will mean the end of their own careers. Alastair Finch, a man of science and reason, is silenced. He is discredited. His report, the single most important document of the 19th century, disappears into a banker's briefcase, never to be seen again. He lives out the rest of his life in obscurity, a broken man, another piece of inconvenient evidence buried by the men who were determined to control the past in order to own the future. The story of the silenced expert is a crucial part of the pattern. It demonstrates that this was not a matter of ignorance or oversight. They knew. They were told by the best minds they had what they had found, and their decision was not to preserve it, but to destroy it with a speed and ruthlessness that betrays a deep and profound fear. So if these buildings were not built by the men of 1891, who built them? If the White City is not a product of the Gilded Age, where did it come from? To answer this question, we must be willing to step outside the comfortable confines of mainstream, officially sanctioned history. We must be willing to entertain a narrative that has been deliberately suppressed, ridiculed, and labeled as conspiracy theory for over a century. We must talk about Tartaria. What is Tartaria? It is not a place you will find on any modern map. It is a ghost in the machine of history. For centuries, old maps, from the 16th to the early 19th century, showed a vast empire called Tartary, or the Tartarian Empire, stretching across a huge portion of Asia, Siberia, and what is now Russia, even extending its influence into the Americas. It was depicted not as a barren wasteland, but as a land of countless cities and advanced people. Then, somewhere in the mid-19th century, it vanishes from the maps, completely, as if it never existed. The theory, in its grandest form, posits that this was no mere regional kingdom. The Tartarian Empire was a global civilization, a technologically and spiritually advanced civilization that was responsible for the vast majority of the magnificent classical and Gothic architecture we see all over the world today. The grand cathedrals of Europe, the soaring state capitol buildings in America, the mysterious star forts found on every continent, the great mosques and temples of the East. They are not the products of dozens of disparate cultures clumsily imitating each other. They are the unified architectural signature of a single, global culture. This civilization, the theory goes, had mastered a different form of physics. They understood harmonics, resonance, and frequency. They built their structures not just for shelter or beauty, but as functional machines. They harnessed the natural electrical energy of the atmosphere, the so-called ether, to power their cities, to heal, to levitate massive stones, and to create a society of abundance without pollution or toil. Their buildings, with their domes, spires, and intricate metalwork, were not merely decorative. They were atmospheric energy conductors. The great pipe organs in their cathedrals were not just for music. They were sonic devices for tuning the very fabric of reality. What happened to them? The theory points to a great cataclysm, a reset event that occurred sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. This was not a slow decline. It was a sudden, catastrophic event. Perhaps a natural disaster, like a comet impact or a polar shift. Perhaps it was a man-made one, a terrible war fought with unimaginable weapons. The most popular version of this theory involves a mud flood, a worldwide event where a liquefaction of the soil or a massive deluge of mud and silt buried their cities, in some cases up to the second or third story. This is why, the theory suggests, we see so many old buildings with windows and doors at ground level that lead to nowhere, buildings where the ground floor is actually a basement. They weren't built that way. The ground level rose up around them. After the cataclysm, the Tartarian civilization was shattered. Its population was decimated. Its knowledge was lost. And into this power vacuum stepped a new group, a parasitic elite. The inheritors, these were the banking families, the secret societies, the cabal of industrialists who did not create, but only took. They found the remnants of the old world, the buried cities, the abandoned technology, and they claimed it as their own. Their great project, for the last 200 years, has been to erase all knowledge of the previous civilization. They rewrite history, they burn books, they demolish buildings. They invent new, false histories for the structures they cannot demolish, calling a Tartarian power station a cathedral or an atmospheric energy device a folly. They create a narrative of slow, linear progress, from the caveman to the smartphone, a narrative that places them at the pinnacle of achievement. Because if humanity ever realized that we are the de-evolved, amnesiac descendants of a far more advanced and harmonious civilization, we would never tolerate the world of scarcity, war, and servitude that the inheritors have created for us. This is the grand, unifying theory, and the 1893 Chicago World's Fair is its smoking gun. The White City was not just a Tartarian city. It was, perhaps, one of the last and most pristine examples they ever found, perfectly preserved in the Chicago marshlands. It was their great and terrible discovery, a city that glowed, a city that hummed with a forgotten power, a city that had to be shown to the world one last time, under a false name, with a false history, before it was extinguished forever. Now, let us re-examine the evidence through this new lens. Let us connect the dots. Suddenly, everything that seemed nonsensical about the official story clicks into place with a terrifying clarity. The name, the White City, it wasn't a poetic nickname because of the white painted staff. It was a literal description. The buildings were constructed from a white, luminescent, alabaster-like material that seemed to glow from within, a hallmark of high Tartarian architecture. The staff story was a pathetic attempt to explain this atechnological, miraculous substance. Thomas Rook's memory of the glowing block of stone wasn't a fever dream. It was a glimpse of the building's true nature. The lagoons and canals. They weren't just for pleasure boating and aesthetic beauty. Look at the maps of the fairgrounds. They form a complex, interconnected system of waterways. In the Tartarian model, water was a key component of their energy system. It acted as a conductor, a coolant, and a medium for harmonic resonance. The water system of the White City was not a decorative feature. It was the circulatory system of a massive, functioning machine. The very layout was a circuit board. The statues. The thousands of statues of heroic, idealized human forms, of gods and goddesses, of mythological beasts. The official story calls them allegorical. But in the Tartarian context, they take on a new meaning. Were they just art? Or were they representations of the builders themselves, a race of men and women who were taller, stronger, healthier? Giants, perhaps, like the ones mentioned in the myths of every culture? Or were the statues themselves functional? Were the metallic armatures within them part of the energy-conducting grid? Were the specific poses and gestures part of a system of harmonic language? The administration building, the glorious centerpiece of the Court of Honor, with its immense, gilded dome. This was not an office building. This was the central power plant. The dome, covered in conductive gold, was the primary atmospheric energy collector. It drew down power from the ether and distributed it throughout the city via the water systems and a network of underground conduits. The fact that this was the very last building to be destroyed in the final, Great Fire is no coincidence. You always take out the power station last. And the demolition. Oh, the demolition. If you see it not as demolition but as a cover-up, the speed and the methods make perfect sense. It was a military operation. The men in the strange suits that Thomas Rook saw were not a wrecking crew. They were a specialized team, sent in to dismantle technology they feared. The dissolving wands were not a construction tool. They were a weapon, a device specifically designed to break down the molecular structure of the Tartarian building material. It was a frantic, desperate effort to erase the evidence before anyone else could get their hands on it. Why the fires? The official story of accidental blazes is the most transparent lie of all. The White City was, by design, largely fireproof. The main structures were stone-like material and steel. To burn them down would require an inferno of incredible intensity. The fires were not accidents. They were industrial-scale acts of destruction. Eyewitness accounts from the time, buried in the back pages of newspapers, speak of strange chemical smells, of flames burning with unnatural colors, greens and purples. They speak of explosions that sounded more like munitions than collapsing timbers. They were using accelerants. They were using thermite or other military-grade incendiaries to generate the heat needed to weaken the steel trusses and bring the great halls crashing down. The fires were the final, brutal act of sterilization. The dissolving wands were too slow for the main structures. They were for surgical removal of key components. For the rest, only total incineration would do. And who was the institutional antagonist behind this all? Who had the motive, the means, and the ruthlessness to pull this off? It was not the city of Chicago. It was not the architects. It was the men who financed the fair, the banking and industrial dynasties of the Gilded Age. The Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Rothschilds, the inheritors. They were the ones who sat on the board of directors. They were the ones who controlled the purse strings. They were the ones who stood to lose the most if the truth of the Tartarian civilization was revealed. Their entire empire was built on a new paradigm of fossil fuels, centralized electrical grids, patent law, and wage slavery. The White City was a testament to a different way, a free energy, free abundance. It was a threat to their entire model of control. So they turned it into a spectacle, a circus. They invited the world to come and gawk at the dying embers of a forgotten golden age, all while charging them admission. They monetized its beauty, and then, when the show was over, they systematically, brutally, and efficiently murdered it, ensuring that its secrets died with it. They were not just demolishing buildings, they were murdering a memory. And who is piecing this story together today? It is the modern seekers, the independent researchers, the digital archivists, the people ridiculed by the mainstream as conspiracy theorists, people like our fictional Jameson Vance, who spends his life in dusty archives and online forums, connecting the dots. He finds the old newspaper clippings describing the impossible speed of the demolition. He unearths the suppressed engineering reports. He traces the family histories of the silenced witnesses. He is the modern-day Alastair Finch, but this time, he has the internet. He cannot be so easily silenced. He is building the case, piece by piece, against the greatest lie ever told. The pattern is not limited to Chicago. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Chicago World's Fair was not an isolated incident. It was merely the most blatant. The late 19th and early 20th centuries are littered with these great expositions and World's Fairs, and they all tell the same impossible story. Let us travel forward in time a decade, to the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. The scale is even more staggering than Chicago. Over 1,200 acres. A collection of temporary palaces that dwarfed even the White City. The centerpiece, the Festival Hall, was a breathtaking structure flanked by cascading waterfalls that seemed to pour from the sky. The official narrative is identical. All of this was built in 2 to 3 years, made of plaster and wood, and then, after the fair, it was all torn down. All of it. Gone. Today, almost nothing remains but a park and a single, small building. Look at the photographs of the St. Louis Fair. The architecture is the same grand Beaux-Arts style, the same impossible scale, the same White City aesthetic. We are told it was an imitation of Chicago. But is it imitation? Or is it the same authentic, global architectural signature? Another unearthed Tartarian complex, given a new name, put on display, and then destroyed. The electrical display at the St. Louis Fair was said to be even more spectacular than Chicago's. They illuminated every building, every fountain, every statue. Where did all that power come from in 1904? Were they really burning that much coal? Or had they simply figured out how to turn on the original power systems of the city they had found? Let's go further west, to San Francisco, 1915. The Panama Pacific International Exposition. Another wonder of the world, risen from the ashes of the 1906 earthquake. Another collection of magnificent domes, arches, and courts, all supposedly made of temporary materials. And after the fair, the same story. The demolition crews moved in, and it all vanished. But in San Francisco, they made a slip. Or perhaps, public sentiment was too strong. They left one piece behind. The Palace of Fine Arts. A hauntingly beautiful rotunda and colonnade, designed by Bernard Maybeck. The official story is that it was so beloved that a local philanthropist paid to have it preserved. It was originally built of staff and wood, we are told, and it quickly fell into ruin and had to be completely demolished and rebuilt with permanent materials in the 1960s. But look closer at that story. It makes no sense. They demolished a temporary building only to rebuild it exactly as it was, but with permanent materials? Is it not far more likely that the Palace of Fine Arts was an original Tartarian structure, made of the same miraculous geopolymer as the rest? That it did not fall into ruin, but was simply so durable that the 1960s demolition crew couldn't easily destroy it. So they invented the story of rebuilding it to cover for the extensive repairs and retrofitting they had to do. It stands today as a silent monument, a piece of the original world that they failed to completely erase. Paris, 1889. The Exposition Universelle. The centerpiece, the Eiffel Tower. We are told it was built as a temporary entrance arch for the fair, a temporary structure that is still standing over 130 years later. Historians marvel at its revolutionary ironwork. But in the Tartarian framework, it is something else. It is not an observation deck. It is an antenna, a colossal atmospheric energy conductor, a classic piece of Tartarian technology drawing power from the ether. The other temporary palaces of the 1889 fair? All gone, demolished. But they left the power antenna standing, perhaps because it was too useful or too difficult to dismantle. The pattern is global, undeniable, and consistent. 1. A World's Fair is announced in a major city. 2. An impossibly grand and ornate city of classical palaces appears in an impossibly short amount of time, on land that was previously undeveloped. 3. The buildings are claimed to be temporary structures made of plaster and wood. 4. The fair runs for 6 months to a year, showcasing the wonders of the new industrial age, all set against the backdrop of this ancient, classical architecture. 5. As soon as the fair is over, the entire complex is rapidly and completely demolished, often with the help of convenient, spectacular fires. 6. All that remains is a public park and a handful of carefully curated, permanent structures. It is a formula, a playbook for historical erasure, repeated over and over again, from Buffalo to Brussels, from Philadelphia to Glasgow. They were not building these fairs. They were finding Tartarian complexes, showing them off one last time, and then wiping them from the face of the earth and from the pages of history. But Chicago was special. Chicago was the test case. It was the first and most audacious of the modern era. The scale was so grand, the construction story so unbelievable, and the demolition so swift and total. In their haste to erase the White City, they revealed their hand. In the completeness of their destruction, they left behind the biggest clues. While in other cities they might have left a building or a tower, in Chicago, they tried to leave nothing. And that totality, that scorched earth policy, speaks not of practicality, but of panic. They were running from something. They were hiding something. They were trying to kill a ghost. What is the motive? Why go to such extraordinary lengths? Why orchestrate a global conspiracy spanning decades to find, display, and then destroy these magnificent structures? It is not enough to say they were simply greedy. The motive runs deeper, into the very foundations of our modern world. The first, and most practical, motive is the control of energy. The Tartarian civilization, as evidenced by the design of its cities, ran on free, abundant, decentralized energy drawn from the atmosphere. The White City was not just a collection of buildings, it was a power plant. A power plant that required no fuel, produced no pollution, and could not be metered. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a John D. Rockefeller, whose entire fortune was built on controlling the oil that fueled the lamps and lubricated the machines of the world. Put yourself in the shoes of A.J. P. Morgan, who was investing millions into Thomas Edison's and Nikola Tesla's competing systems of centralized, wired electricity, a system that required massive power plants, miles of copper wire, and a meter on every house. The existence, let alone the rediscovery, of free energy technology was not just a threat to their business model. It was an existential threat. It would have rendered their entire industrial empire obsolete overnight. They could not compete with free. So they had to erase the very knowledge that it was ever possible. They had to destroy the hardware, the great atmospheric collectors, the resonant water systems, the entire infrastructure of the old world. They had to replace it with their own, inferior, but eminently controllable and profitable system of wires and pipes. The demolition of the White City was not just architectural vandalism. It was the violent enforcement of a new energy paradigm. The second motive is the control of history. As the saying goes, he who controls the past controls the future. The discovery of a global, advanced, harmonious civilization that predates our own completely shatters the narrative of linear progress that is the bedrock of modern authority. Our entire system is predicated on the idea that we are the most advanced, the most enlightened, the most capable humans who have ever lived. We are taught to look back on the past as a dark age of ignorance, superstition, and brutality. What happens to that narrative if it is proven that 500 or 1,000 years ago, people were living in magnificent, clean, powered cities, in harmony with nature, while our own industrial revolution was choking our cities with smoke and filth? What happens to the authority of our leaders, political, scientific, and religious, if it is proven that they are not the torchbearers of progress, but the janitors of a fallen kingdom who have been lying to us for centuries? The system would collapse. People would begin to ask questions. If they could do that then, why can't we do that now? If they had free energy, why are we paying exorbitant bills for electricity that is poisoning the planet? If they could build cities of breathtaking beauty and harmony, why do we live in a world of strip malls and brutalist concrete boxes? The questions themselves are the threat. The knowledge of our lost inheritance is the threat. To maintain their power, the inheritors had to sever us from our past. They had to make us believe that this world of war, scarcity, and environmental destruction is the best humanity can do. They had to convince us that we are fallen, sinful, and helpless, and that we need them to guide us. The destruction of the White City was an act of psychological warfare. It was designed to induce a planetary amnesia. Finally, there is the deepest, most philosophical motive: the control of human potential. The architecture of the Tartarian world was not just functional, it was inspirational. It was designed to elevate the human spirit. The soaring domes, the perfect geometric proportions, the use of light and sound. It was all designed to resonate with the higher aspects of our consciousness, to remind us of our divine nature. Living in such an environment would have a profound effect on human development. It would foster creativity, health, and spiritual awareness. The world the inheritors have built is the exact opposite. It is a world of low frequencies, of discordant architecture, of ugliness and stress. A world designed to keep us sick anxious, and distracted. A world that keeps our consciousness locked into a low vibrational state of survival and fear. Because a fearful, sick, and distracted population is an easily controlled population. They destroyed the White City not just because it was a power plant or a historical record, but because it was a template for a higher state of being. And they could not allow that template to exist. Let us return, one last time, to our silenced expert, Professor Alastair Finch. Imagine him in his last years, an old, forgotten man, writing a final letter to a trusted former colleague, the only one who didn't turn his back on him. The letter is never sent. It is found in his desk after his death. My dear friend, it begins. You must forgive this intrusion from a ghost. I have had many years to reflect on the events of '93, and in my solitude, I believe I have finally come to understand the true nature of the crime I witnessed. We, in our scientific arrogance, called it a feat of engineering. The public, in their innocence, called it a dream. But the men who ordered its destruction, they knew what it was. They knew it was a holy place. I do not mean holy in the religious sense, but in the vibrational sense. It was a place tuned to a higher harmony. To walk through the court of honor was to feel your own cellular structure subtly realign. The light, the sounds, the very proportions of the space were a form of medicine for the soul. They did not demolish a city, my friend. They butchered it. They committed an act of spiritual desecration on a scale that is unimaginable. And they did it because they fear it. They fear the memory encoded in the very stones. A memory of a humanity that was not fallen, but magnificent. A humanity that could build heaven on earth. They fear those stones because the stones remember a truth that makes their empires of steel and smoke seem like a child's tantrum in the face of eternity. They can grind the buildings to dust, but they cannot erase the frequency. It is still there, ringing in the soil of Jackson Park. And someday, people will learn to hear it again. The truth, like energy, cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. It can be buried, suppressed, and lied about. But it always, eventually, finds its way back to the surface. The evidence of the White City is not just in the old photographs and the suppressed reports. It is in the persistent, nagging feeling that we have been lied to. It is in the inexplicable, universal human yearning for a lost golden age. It is in the strange, phantom limb sensation that our world is missing something grand and beautiful that was once there. The men of 1894 thought they had succeeded. They thought they had buried the truth under a pile of ash and rubble. But they underestimated the resilience of memory. They underestimated the power of a story that refuses to die. They didn't build the White City. They found it. And then, they killed it.